Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Finca San Pedro wash processed Ecuador from Thankfully Coffee. And there's the bag right there. And Thankfully, based out of Waverly, Alabama. And they're a coffee roaster that's appeared on this channel on numerous occasions, including our recent review of the Pilco Caja, a different wash processed Ecuadorian coffee. And when I found out Thankfully Coffee was releasing this one as well as the Finca Surya, both of which immediately caught my interest, as we had reviewed both of these coffees from Say last year. However, up to this point, Say was the only coffee roaster that had released each of these coffees individually, as the two of them do make up the Putuccio coffees, which is a coffee that we have reviewed from a number of different coffee roasters. However, seeing them separated in Finca Surya and Finca San Pedro is something that we've only seen from Say and Thankfully up to this point. So having an opportunity to review it from a different coffee roaster immediately caught our interest. So we will see how this coffee turned out, as this right here is day 51. And recipe we went with for this coffee was a toned down recipe and a 15:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 93 degrees Celsius, about 199 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which does indicate a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this coffee, this one is their extra light profile, which there has been some discussion about Thankfully's extra light profiles in the past, as they're not necessarily quite as light as what you would typically associate with maybe an extra light profile from something like September, H&S, or even coffees that Shoebox does release. However, steadily you have seen Thankfully go a little bit lighter with their coffees, and in comparison to the two coffees that we did have from Say last year, their Finca Surya and their Finca San Pedro, we can definitely say that this one is lighter, and in comparison to some of the Say coffees that we've reviewed recently as well, we can definitely say that it is a bit lighter than those coffees too. But just for context, Thankfully does recommend 3 to 4 weeks with the majority of their extra light profiled coffees. So that's to say they're pretty light, but not necessarily to the same extent as what you might expect from a lot of other ultralight based coffee roasters. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 26, first impression. So we did wait close to 4 weeks for this coffee, and this one was actually the more enjoyable of the two. So obviously we're going to be reviewing the Finca Surya as well, but right from the onset I found this one to be much more lively and much more intense, especially in the fruit sense. The listed palm fruits were very apt, given a very prominent sugary sweetness and brightness to it, and there's also a little bit more intensity to the citrus. So overall it was a pretty nice first impression of this coffee, largely because it did offer a fair bit more intensity than the Finca Surya. And I'll probably discuss both of these coffees side by side as we're going through both reviews, but we'll go ahead and move on to day 29 as we opted for the Chemex, and there was a similar sentiment this time around as well, as it does continue to remain a bit more intense, brighter, and sweeter in comparison to the Finca Surya as of this moment. A very elegant white florality to it in a sugary sense, with plenty of the citric aspects, making for a very nice day this time around as well. So as of this moment, I did have a preference for this coffee based off the first couple of tries. Day 32 through the UFO Brewer. And the coffee is better today, but there wasn't quite as much of a drastic change and shift to this coffee in comparison to the Surya, and obviously when we get to the Surya we'll discuss that more. But it was at its best as it did cool down, as the focus was on the brightness and white floral qualities of the coffee in a more lingering sense. So the reason why I continuously bring up a lot of the notes for the Surya is because I honestly thought that I was going to review the Finca Surya first, but a little bit of a spoiler alert, I did enjoy the Finca Surya a little bit more than the Finca San Pedro, so that's why we're kind of going back and forth on the notes. But as of this moment, this coffee has actually been the better of the two. Day 35 through the V60 with Thankfully's recipe. So they suggested a higher extraction one, 16:1 at 99 degrees Celsius, and it didn't necessarily work overly well for me, as I felt like this coffee was either a beneficiary of the natural progression, or it really doesn't present quite as well through this brew method, as it did seem to accentuate a little bit more of the citric qualities in comparison to the UFO Brewer Day, as it has opened up over time with more intensity to it. However, it was skewing in a direction that wasn't quite as enjoyable for me. Obviously, when it comes to these Mejorado coffees, my biggest priority is to bring out the most amount of sweetness that I can from them, given that they do have just that classic underlying sweetness to, I want to say, basically every Mejorado coffee that we've ever reviewed. So having it maybe skew away from that in a little bit more of a citric sense, not ideal for me. but we'll go ahead and move on to day 38 as we opted for the Chemex with the same adjustments. And this was my least favorite day of the coffee we had just overall, as it was a bit more generic in terms of the brightness. The citric aspects were most dominant to it, as it does open up a little bit with the coffee cooling down in a more sugary sense. However, having this one skew so much more in the lemon-like sense wasn't necessarily ideal. A lot of brightness, which can be a nice selling point to some people, but for me, I think I was just enjoying some of the earlier days a bit more. Day 41 through the V60 with some lower extraction adjustments, so 15-1 at 93 degrees Celsius, and the coffee was very nice today, as it feels like it definitely benefited from us going a little lower on the extraction for this one, as there was a much better presentation of the sweetness to it, especially in a more prominent sugary apple sense. Very sweet coffee, excellent all around, really seemed to enjoy this day quite a bit, and that's why we did opt for the recipe for this coffee, given just how well of an experience we had here on this day 41 mark. Day 44 through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and the coffee is generally a little better this time around today. It is toned down in comparison to the previous day. However, it still has an abundance of those palm fruit qualities and characteristics. Citric otherwise, but definitely plenty of cleanliness and sweetness to it. So I think this is kind of a great opportunity to stop right there and discuss the recipe that we did opt for with this coffee, and it's going to be the same recipe with the Finca Surya. I've said in the past with a lot of Mejorado coffees, I would say probably more than 50% of them, I found them to be better when you do tone them down, when you don't push them as hard as you do a lot of other coffees. And especially when it comes to Pepe's coffee specifically, and of course this is not Pepe's coffee, technically it's Jose's coffee, but it seems to be consistent with these coffees as well, as I found them to be so much more enjoyable regardless of brew method when we just kept the extraction a little bit lower to them, as I felt like it allowed for the sugariness, the sweetness to become much more pronounced within the coffee itself. Day 47 through the V60, final notes we have with the lower extraction adjustments once again. Coffee is nice once again, as it is skewing a little bit more in the citric bright sense, especially as the coffee does cool down. But otherwise it's very sweet, just in a different way in comparison to the Finca Surya, as the majority of the sweetness comes through in a sugary palm fruit sense with some honey as well. So if you were to tell me that you were going to give me a Mejorado coffee that has a lot of apple-like qualities, apple-like sugary qualities to it, and some honey qualities to it, and it was one that was from Pepe Hijón, Jose Hijón, I'd be like, yeah, that sounds exactly like what I would expect for a standard wash-processed Mejorado. So this coffee, in theory, is a lot of what I would expect from something like this. All right, so let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. We have a lot of level 4s, so let's go through those. We'll start with the cleanliness level 4. Very clean, very well-defined coffee. Zero complaints about that whatsoever. And even then, the definition to this coffee is just very lovely. So I do believe the notes they have on here are apple, pear, lemon meringue, white florals, all of that stuff. A lot of it makes so much sense, especially given that there's much more of that palm fruit sugariness to it, a lot of that palm fruit brightness, at the same time a lot of the citric brightness. I mean, this coffee is very well defined, very clean, and I do think the profile of this coffee definitely did seem to accentuate those characteristics. So very happy with the cleanliness level of definition to this coffee. Let's go ahead and move on to the finish level 4. Probably an underrated component of this coffee. It tastes like Mejorado in the finish, and that's something that I maybe didn't highlight enough, but there's a lot of sugariness to it, there's a lot of sweetness. It's going to be the same with the Finca Surya. I think I just kind of wanted to separate the way that they finish, though. Truth be told, they have a pretty similar finish. It's a lot of the other qualities and characteristics of both these coffees that shows the pretty prominent differences. I mean, the fact that every single day I brewed these coffees, I brewed one right after the other, I was able to see just how different they are, and it's pretty obvious when you're brewing these coffees one after another. So the finish, it's very similar, very sweet, very sugary, a lot of what you'd expect again from a Mejorado. Sweetness level 4, very, very sweet coffee. And this is one of those Mejorados where the only reason why it's not higher is because other ones like the Tioxy exists, or the Nebulae, the one that we had reviewed from thankfully earlier this year, exists, which were unbelievably sweet for a wash processed coffee. So it's definitely on the higher side of level 4, and it's on the verge of that level 5. The only reason why it's not is because other slightly sweeter wash processed Mejorado coffees exist. But even for a Mejorado, it's very sweet. Acidity level 4. I will spoil this part. This is definitely higher than the Finca Surya. A lot of the brightness from this coffee is, I would assume, is where so much of the brightness from Putuccio comes from, given that there's a pretty stark contrast between these two coffees in terms of that specific quality. And if there's one thing I really need to highlight about this coffee and how it differs from the Finca Surya, it's that this coffee was a lot brighter. Florality level 4, there's that honey floral quality to it. Again, I do believe that they have a white floral characteristic to it, but it has that honeysuckle characteristic that is pretty synonymous with a lot of these Mejorado coffees too. So that's right there at that level 4 mark. Citrus level 4, all of the fruit characteristics from this coffee come specifically in that category. So the apple characteristics, the palm fruit characteristics, all of those are most closely aligned with the citric fruit qualities. The lemon, I do have to say, the more we continue to work through this coffee, the more dominant that became within it as well. So citrus, definitely pretty prominent within this coffee. Caramel level 4, that's that brown candy characteristic, and people have joked about it since the very, very first time we ever reviewed a Mejorado coffee, but when it's there, and it's very enjoyable. So I loved that part about this coffee. Also that kind of candied honey quality that's also pretty common within these coffees. Level 3, very happy with that in this one. Body level 3, I can't quite remember off the top of my head if that is different from the Finca Surya, but it does have a little bit more body and texture to it overall. I always say Mejorados fluctuate in the body between a 2 and a 3. I don't think we've had any that have gone lower or higher. Same thing with the acidity, somewhere between a 3 and the 4, and this one right here is on the higher end of both of those, which does give it, I would say, a little bit more depth for some people. Yeah, outside of that though, as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I've already spoiled it. I did have a slight preference towards the Finca Surya, but it wasn't as drastic of a difference between the two. There were some days where I enjoyed this coffee. One of these coffees was more enjoyable with certain brew methods and certain recipes, where the other one was more enjoyable with different brew methods and different recipes. But the one that I settled on towards the end, the lower extraction adjustments for both, was the best results I got from both of them. And the best results I got from the Finca Surya, I enjoyed just a little bit more than the best results I got from the Finca San Pedro. But the differences are pretty stark. They're pretty obvious to me as well. One of them is just a little bit more bright. One of them is a little bit more citric fruit forward and a little bit more body. And then the other one, well, when we get to the Finca Surya, we'll discuss that. But as you can imagine, that's why my preference is skewed a little bit more towards that coffee, as the citric qualities and characteristics are fine. I did really enjoy the palm fruit characteristics. I've said in the past that opal apples are my favorite, and if there's one thing specifically other than that brown candy quality that's pretty common in Mejorado coffees that I could say are very consistent with Mejorado coffees, it's the same sort of sugariness that comes from the opal apples that are also pretty common in so many of these Mejorado coffees. So nothing but positives to say about this coffee. Honestly, it wasn't that far away from the Finca Surya. I found it to be very Mejorado-esque in a number of ways, and as a result, it made for a very enjoyable experience. Honestly, probably my second favorite coffee we've had from Thankfully, outside of the other Pepe coffee that we had reviewed from them earlier this year. So massive credit to them. Of course, massive credit to the producer, but everyone already knows that I'm a fan of Pepe and Jose's coffees overall. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. If you want your slightly brighter Mejorado coffee, then this offers all of the Mejorado characteristics. It's clean, it's sweet, it's got the sugariness to it, it's got that brown candy characteristic to it, and it's used a little bit more in the citric sense. So that's the best direction I can point somebody towards on this one. It's also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Finca San Pedro wash processed Ecuador from Thankfully Coffee. Thank you for watching.